Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the darkest mysteries one story at a time. Today we dive into the chilling tale of a pizzeria owner whose secrets were buried deeper than his dough. In the small, quiet town of Maplewood, life was simple and predictable. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, the town was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, and crime was almost unheard of. The heart of the community was Tony's Slice of Heaven, a cozy pizzeria run by Tony Marconi, a man in his late 40s with a booming laugh and a reputation for kindness. Tony was a fixture in Maplewood, always ready with a joke or a free slice for a struggling family. His pizzeria was more than just a restaurant. It was a gathering place where friendships were forged and memories were made. But in the fall of 2018, the town's peaceful rhythm was shattered when Emily Carter, a 24-year-old aspiring journalist, vanished without a trace. Emily was a bright and curious young woman who had recently moved to Maplewood to be closer to her aging grandparents. She had been working on a story about the town's history, digging into old records and interviewing locals. Her passion for uncovering hidden truths had led her to Tony's Slice of Heaven, where she had spent hours talking to Tony about the town's past. Witnesses recalled seeing her there just days before her disappearance, scribbling notes and asking questions with her characteristic enthusiasm. At first, the police assumed Emily had simply left town. She was young, after all, and her career as a journalist might have taken her elsewhere. But her family insisted this was impossible. Emily was close to her grandparents and had been excited about her project. She wouldn't have left without telling anyone. Her car was still parked outside her apartment, and her belongings were untouched. As days turned into weeks, the initial theory of a voluntary disappearance began to crumble. The investigation led detectives to retrace Emily's steps. They learned she had been particularly interested in the history of an old orphanage that had once stood on the site where Tony's Pizzeria now operated. The orphanage, known as Maplewood Home for Children, had burned down in the 1980s under mysterious circumstances. Emily had been asking questions about the fire and the people connected to it. Her notes, which were later found in her apartment, hinted at a dark secret tied to the orphanage, though she hadn't yet uncovered the full story. Tony Marconi became a person of interest, not because of any direct evidence, but because he was one of the last people to see Emily alive. When questioned, Tony was cooperative but vague. He admitted to speaking with Emily about the town's history, but claimed he knew nothing about the orphanage's darker past. His calm demeanor and reputation as a pillar of the community made it hard for anyone to suspect him of wrongdoing. As the weeks dragged on, the case grew cold. Emily's family held vigils and the town rallied around them, but there were no new leads. The disappearance became a haunting mystery, a shadow over Maplewood that no one could shake. People began to avoid Tony's Slice of Heaven, not because they suspected Tony, but because the pizzeria had become a painful reminder of the young woman who had vanished without a trace. Little did anyone know the answers to Emily's disappearance were closer than they thought, hidden beneath the very floorboards of the place where the town had gathered for years. The truth was buried deep, waiting for someone to uncover it, and when it finally came to light, it would reveal a horror no one in Maplewood could have imagined. A year after Emily Carter's disappearance, life in Maplewood had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The initial shock had faded, but the mystery of what happened to the young journalist lingered like a dark cloud over the town. Tony's Slice of Heaven remained open, though business had slowed. Tony Marconi continued to greet customers with his usual cheer, but there was a subtle tension in the air, as if the pizzeria itself held secrets it wasn't ready to reveal. That all changed when a new employee, a college student named Jake, started working at the pizzeria. Jake had taken the job to save money for tuition, and he quickly became familiar with the daily routines of the place. One evening, while closing up, he was sent to the basement to fetch supplies. The basement was dimly lit and cluttered with boxes of ingredients, old furniture, and equipment. It was a place most employees avoided unless necessary, but Jake didn't think much of it until he noticed something odd. As he moved a stack of flour sacks, a faint, unpleasant smell caught his attention. It wasn't the usual musty odor of a basement. It was sharper, more metallic. Curious, Jake followed the scent to a corner of the room where the concrete floor looked uneven. Kneeling down, he noticed a section of the floor that seemed to have been disturbed recently. The tiles were loose, and when he pried one up, he found a hidden compartment beneath. Inside the compartment was a small, blood-stained notebook and a set of old keys. Jake's heart raced as he flipped through the notebook. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and references to the old orphanage that had once stood on the site. One name stood out repeatedly: Richard Holloway, the former director of the Maplewood Home for Children. The notes were cryptic, but hinted at something sinister: a dark secret tied to the orphanage and its connection to Tony's Pizzeria. Jake knew he had stumbled onto something significant. He quickly took photos of the notebook and the compartment before carefully putting everything back in place. The next morning, he went straight to the police, handing over the evidence and recounting his discovery. The officers, who had all but given up on the Emily Carter case, were immediately intrigued. The police obtained a warrant to search the pizzeria's basement more thoroughly. Tony Marconi was visibly nervous when they arrived, but he cooperated, insisting he had no idea what they were talking about. As officers began to excavate the area where Jake had found the compartment, they uncovered more disturbing evidence: a hidden crawl space beneath the floor, filled with old documents, photographs, and items that seemed to belong to children, toys, clothing, and even a small, tattered backpack. The blood-stained notebook was confirmed to belong to Emily Carter. Her notes detailed her investigation into the orphanage's history and her growing suspicion that Tony Marconi was connected to its dark past. She had written about a fire that destroyed the orphanage in the 1980s, questioning whether it was truly an accident. Her final entry, dated just days before her disappearance, mentioned a planned meeting with Tony to discuss her findings. The discovery of the hidden compartment in Emily's notebook sent shockwaves through Maplewood. Tony was brought in for questioning, but he remained calm and composed, denying any involvement in Emily's disappearance or the secrets buried beneath his pizzeria. Without concrete evidence linking him to a crime, the police had no choice but to let him go. But the town's trust in Tony had been shattered. Rumors spread like wildfire, and Tony's slice of heaven became a place of suspicion rather than comfort. Jake, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The keys he had found in the compartment didn't match any locks in the building, and he couldn't help but wonder what they unlocked, and what other secrets might still be buried beneath the pizzeria's unassuming facade. The investigation was far from over, and as the police dug deeper, they would uncover truths that would change Maplewood forever. The basement, once just a storage space, had become the gateway to a mystery that would unravel the town's darkest secrets and reveal the horrifying fate of Emily Carter. The discovery of Emily Carter's notebook and the hidden compartment in Tony's Pizzeria sent the investigation into overdrive. Detectives began piecing together the fragments of information, determined to uncover the truth behind Emily's disappearance and the dark secrets tied to the old orphanage. As they dug deeper, they made a shocking discovery. Tony Marconi was not who he claimed to be. Through fingerprint analysis and cross-referencing with national databases, the police learned that Tony's real name was Victor Graziano. He had a criminal record in another state, with charges ranging from fraud to embezzlement. Victor had disappeared from public records in the late 1980s. Around the same time the Maplewood home for children burned down, it became clear that he had assumed a new identity and started a new life in Maplewood, opening Tony's Slice of Heaven shortly after arriving in town. The revelation sent ripples through the community. Tony, or Victor, had been a beloved figure in Maplewood for over a decade, and the idea that he had been living a lie was difficult for many to accept. But the evidence was undeniable, and it raised even more questions. Why had Victor chosen Maplewood? What was his connection to the orphanage? And what had really happened the night it burned down? Detectives turned their attention to the history of the Maplewood Home for Children. The orphanage had been run by a man named Richard Holloway, who was described as charismatic but deeply secretive. Former staff members and residents recalled strange occurrences during Holloway's tenure: children who went missing under mysterious circumstances, late-night meetings with unknown visitors, and an atmosphere of fear that permeated the building. The fire that destroyed the orphanage in 1980s had been ruled an accident, but Emily's notes suggested otherwise. She had uncovered rumors that Holloway had been involved in illegal activities, including child trafficking, and that the fire might have been set to cover up his crimes. The police began to suspect that Victor Graziano had been involved with Holloway. Records showed that Victor had lived in the same city as Holloway during the early 1980s and had a history of financial crimes that could have funded illegal operations. It seemed likely that Victor had been Holloway's accomplice, helping him exploit vulnerable children for profit. When the fire threatened to expose their activities, Victor had fled, assumed a new identity, and started over in Maplewood. But the investigation took an even darker turn when detectives discovered that Richard Holloway had also disappeared after the fire. There was no record of his death, and no one had seen or heard from him since. Emily's notes hinted that she believed Holloway might have been killed to ensure his silence. This theory gained traction when forensic experts examined the items found in the pizzeria's hidden compartment. Among the children's belongings were documents bearing Holloway's name, including financial records and a list of names that appeared to be code for something far more sinister. The police began to suspect that Victor had not only been involved in Holloway's crimes, but had also played a role in his disappearance. The blood-stained notebook and the hidden compartment suggested that Victor had gone to great lengths to cover up his past. Emily Carter, with her relentless curiosity, had stumbled onto the truth, and it had cost her her life. As the investigation progressed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Victor Graziano, the man everyone in Maplewood had known as Tony Marconi, was not just a fraudster or a liar. He was a man with a horrifying past, one that involved the exploitation and suffering of innocent children. The fire that destroyed the orphanage had been a desperate attempt to erase that past, but the secrets had never truly been buried. The police knew they were close to uncovering the full story, but they needed more evidence to bring Victor to justice. The keys found in the compartment remained a mystery, and detectives couldn't shake the feeling that they were the key to unlocking the final chapter of this dark and twisted tale. As they prepared to dig deeper, the town of Maplewood held its breath, waiting for the truth to finally come to light. The discovery of Richard Holloway's name in the hidden compartment beneath Tony's Pizzeria marked a turning point in the investigation. Detectives were now certain that Victor Graziano, the man known as Tony Marconi, had been deeply involved in the dark activities of the Maplewood Home for Children. But to bring him to justice, they needed concrete evidence, something that would tie him directly to the crimes and reveal the full extent of his involvement. The police obtained a warrant to conduct a more thorough search of the pizzeria and its surrounding property. Using ground-penetrating radar, they scanned the area beneath the basement and detected anomalies in the soil, irregularities that suggested something had been buried there. With a sense of grim determination, they began to excavate the site. What they uncovered was beyond anyone's worst fears. Beneath the pizzeria's foundation, they found human remains. Multiple sets of bones, some belonging to children and one to an adult. The adult remains were identified as Richard Holloway, the former director of the orphanage. The children's remains were harder to identify, but forensic analysis suggested they were likely residents of the Maplewood Home for Children who had gone missing over the years. The bones showed signs of trauma, indicating that the victims had met violent ends. Holloway's skull had a fracture consistent with a blunt force injury, while the children's remains bore marks that suggested they had been subjected to prolonged abuse. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town and confirmed what Emily Carter had suspected. The orphanage had been a front for something far more sinister. Victor Graziano was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. Under intense interrogation, he finally broke down and confessed. He admitted to killing Richard Holloway, claiming it was an act of self-preservation. According to Victor, Holloway had become a liability after the fire, threatening to expose their crimes if Victor didn't continue to fund his operations. In a fit of rage and fear, Victor had killed him and buried his body beneath the pizzeria. But Victor's confession didn't stop there. He also admitted to killing the children whose remains were found at the site. He claimed that Holloway had been the mastermind behind the trafficking ring, but Victor had played an active role in luring vulnerable children from the orphanage and delivering them to Holloway's clients. When the fire threatened to expose their operation, Victor had silenced everyone who could implicate him, including the children who had been used as pawns in their horrific scheme. The revelations were almost too much to comprehend. Victor Graziano, the man who had been a beloved figure in Maplewood, was a cold-blooded killer who had spent decades hiding behind a mask of kindness and generosity. The pizzeria, once a symbol of community and warmth, had been built on a foundation of lies, violence, and unimaginable suffering. As the investigation continued, detectives uncovered more evidence linking Victor to the crimes. Financial records showed that he had funneled money from his pizzeria into offshore accounts, likely profits from the trafficking ring. The keys found in the hidden compartment were traced to a storage unit in a nearby city, where police discovered more documents, photographs, and items that had belonged to the victims. The town of Maplewood was left reeling. Families who had once gathered at Tony's Slice of Heaven now struggled to come to terms with the fact that they had been dining in a place built on the graves of innocent children. The case became a national sensation, drawing attention to the dark underbelly of small-town life and the lengths to which some would go to protect their secrets. Victor Graziano's trial was swift and decisive. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his confession left no room for doubt. In 2021, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the families of the victims, the closure they had hoped for remained elusive. The full extent of the crimes committed at the Maplewood Home for Children might never be known, and the scars left by Victor's actions would linger for generations. As the town began to heal, one question remained unanswered. What had happened to Emily Carter? Her body had never been found, but the blood-stained notebook and Victor's confession left little doubt about her fate. She had been a brave young woman who had come too close to the truth and paid the ultimate price for her courage. The trial of Victor Graziano, once known as Tony Marconi, brought a sense of justice to Maplewood, but it also left a haunting void. While Victor had confessed to the murders of Richard Holloway and the children whose remains were found beneath the pizzeria, the fate of Emily Carter remained a painful mystery. Her family and the community clung to the hope that she might still be found, even as the evidence pointed to a grim conclusion. The blood-stained notebook discovered in the hidden compartment had been a crucial piece of evidence, but it was only part of the story. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood on the notebook matched Emily's DNA, and Victor's confession provided the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Under intense questioning, he admitted that Emily had uncovered his connection to the orphanage and the crimes committed there. Fearing exposure, he had lured her to the pizzeria under the guise of an interview, where he confronted her about her investigation. Victor claimed that Emily had threatened to go to the police with her findings, leaving him no choice but to silence her. He described a struggle in the basement during which he struck her with a heavy object. The blow was fatal, and Victor, panicked and desperate to cover his tracks, disposed of her body in a location he refused to disclose. Despite extensive searches of the surrounding area, Emily's remains were never found, leaving her family without the closure they so desperately needed. The revelation of Emily's fate sent shockwaves through Maplewood. She had been a bright, determined young woman with a promising future, and her death was a stark reminder of the evil that had been lurking in their midst. The town, once known for its peaceful charm, was forever changed by the horrifying secrets that had been buried beneath its beloved pizzeria. In the aftermath of the trial, the community came together to honor Emily's memory. A memorial was erected in the town square featuring a plaque with her name and a quote from one of her journal entries. "The truth is worth fighting for, no matter the cost." The pizzeria was permanently closed and the building was eventually demolished, replaced by a small park dedicated to the victims of Victor's crimes. The park became a place of reflection and healing, a symbol of the town's resilience in the face of unimaginable darkness.